Hi everyone, I am Bryna Parcells. I am the Safe Church Coordinator for Classis Grandville, and I am so excited to have the opportunity to do this virtual training for you on abuse prevention and response in terms of especially dealing with the little ones, the young ones of our church. So yeah, without further ado, here are the goals I am hoping that we can accomplish, the things we will cover today. We're going to talk about why Safe Church Ministry and abuse response prevention, why should we care? We will define the types of abuse and power and control. We will also learn through some scenarios and have some practice in responding to scenarios, recognizing the signs of abuse, and we will discuss how to respond to either accusations or suspicions of abuse. So, first, why Safe Church Ministry? And there was a 1989 survey commissioned by Synod where we had found that 28% of adults in the CRC had experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. 15% of adults in the CRC had been abused by another person physically, sexually, or emotionally. Children between the ages of birth and 12 years old are most likely to be abused, and persons with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience abuse than the average adult. And we also know the statistics that 1 in 4 in the general public, but this is in the church too, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys will experience abuse before the age of 18. But this was a survey done in 1989. Are these statistics still true? Are they still relevant? Well, the good news is that the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network has reported that sexual violence has fallen by about half since 1993, which is awesome. The bad news is that the Kent County Children's Advocacy Center, who regularly deals with incidences of child abuse, estimates that between 1 and 10% of child molestation cases are ever reported. That means between 99 and 90% of cases of child molestation go unreported. So we have the high potential to have a lot of hurting people in our congregations, and we really want to lower those numbers so that we don't have more victims in our congregations. So we have these statistics, and it's worth to know what is power. You'll see I'm going to give you a definition of power, like the official definition, but I want you to just take this and put it in your own words so that you have your own understanding of what power means. So simply stated, power is the ability to influence or affect an outcome. We all have power as human beings. Some of us are given more power as a result of our abilities, our role, our status within a community. And when power is stewarded well, it brings growth and flourishing and beauty to all the people and really expresses the shalom of the kingdom of God. Abuse of power. Power can be abused. Power can be used to harm another person intentionally or just through ignorance, subtly or overtly, often but not always, to advance one's own desire without regard for the needs or desires of others, always disturbing the flourishing of God's people. And it's worth noting that at the core of all types of abuse are behaviors related to issues of power and control. The same power dynamic shows up in all types of abuse, whether sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, or spiritual abuse. And I think an excellent example of this is from child's literature. If you look at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you look at the White Witch, Jadis, and you look at Edmund, they were the source of all the conflict in that book. Edmund is just a pain and a nuisance and a problem for his siblings. And Jadis has just been oppressing the people of Narnia with endless winter but never Christmas. And why? Because they want power. Edmund is willing to deceive his siblings to be the one prince who rules under Jadis. And Jadis wants to have Edmund come so she can destroy him and his siblings so that she can maintain her status as the one ruler of Narnia. you can see that power is at the root of this. And that's the same in our real lives. You can see when most sins, right, are committed out of our desire for power and control. So it's worth knowing when we have power, how to best use it, and to make sure that we are not abusing it. So one of the most unfamiliar types of abuse is spiritual abuse, because we have physical abuse and neglect, we have sexual abuse, emotional, verbal abuse, and spiritual abuse. So spiritual abuse is the use of spiritual authority by Christian leaders to promote, protect, or enrich a person or a Christian institution, regardless of the spiritual damage done to innocent parties in the cause of Christ. This is a quote from Reverend Dr. Murray, and Reverend Murray is actually the minister at First CRC in Byron Center, and he has some really good articles on responding well to abuse. So if you ever are interested in learning more from Dr. Murray, you can Google Reverend Murray, Murray, and abuse or responses to abuse. So another way of thinking about spiritual abuse is that they are some of the most sinister. Spiritual abuse is the most sinister form of abuse. It's a lot like verbal and emotional abuse, which are very detrimental and hard to demonstrate. But this carries with it that spiritual weight, that spiritual twist, and it uses principles and maxims of faith as weapons. And you could see something like this in an instance where there's an instance of, say, domestic violence or child abuse, and the church, rather than coming along and supporting the person making the claim of abuse, who is, the victim, is saying, no, that couldn't have happened. That person is a good person in our church. They're of high standing. We can't deal with the idea that this person has done it. And then we would say, you need to just submit to your husband, or you need to just control your children. They are out of line in this behavior. Children, you must obey your parents. You have to respect adults. That would be using scripture and scriptural ideas, biblical ideas, to further abuse and to abuse. And so doing that, we can create confusion and leave someone perplexed and not understanding, and it can create as much damage as emotional abuse, but it carries that extra weight as if this abuse came from God, because it's someone who is in a position of spiritual moral authority misusing their power. So this next slide is not exactly related to child abuse, but it's very worth knowing because it's still connected to that idea of power and control. And it's the Duluth model wheel, and you can see that there's the physical violence side and the sexual violence side. And while this model is specifically directed at domestic violence, you can see how these themes in those spokes of the wheel can be carried out and used in either sexual or physical or emotional abuse of children. For example, using coercion and threats, right? Children are often told, if you tell, I will hurt your family, or if you tell, I will be sent to jail, and they don't want to hurt someone, or I will hurt your parents. You can also minimizing, denying, and blaming. Gaslighting is something that we like to refer to nowadays, where instead of allowing the person to say, yes, you were abused, the abuser says, no, you're just crazy. That didn't happen. That's not how I remember it. Are you sure you got that right? Leaving the person thinking, wait, what? Am I thinking, am I crazy? Is this happening? And then they're not going to report because they're not sure that they're even being abused. So it's just knowing that power and control are, again, at the root of most, especially domestic violence, but most abuse cases. And it's worth knowing that children who see domestic abuse, let's say their mom being abused, experience just as much, if not more, trauma than the person being physically assaulted. And unfortunately, with all of the COVID shutdowns and things like that we've had, domestic abuse cases rose. And we don't know how much of that is still going on in our churches, in our families, in our schools. So it's really worth keeping an eye out for these abusive power signs or ways listed in this wheel. All right, power and control. That was all the bad news, but power and control through the lens of the gospel. Philippians 2, starting at verse 2, says, "Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man." There is no denying that Jesus had and has power. And there is no denying that he has always been a leader, but he was a servant leader. He was not out for what was in it for him. And we need to have that mindset as we are leading the children in our churches, that we are here not for what we get out of it or the good feelings we get, but for what we can put in and how we can further the kingdom. And part of that is guarding the hearts, minds, and bodies of those entrusted to our care and to serve them in love and grace and humility. So a really great inspiration for how to respond to abuse and to hearing the devastating effects of abuse is to learn from Rachel Den Hollander. So she is known as the first woman to speak publicly against the abuse of Larry Nassar, the former osteopathic physician and professor at Michigan State University and the USA Gymnastics team doctor. She has continued to speak out against abuse in a variety of contexts. She wrote a book called What is a Girl Worth? And she was a speaker in Calvin University's 2019 January series, and you can view her speech online, which was called A Time to Speak, addressing justice and forgiveness. She was also a guest on the podcast on the topic, What Pastors Need to Know About Sexual Abuse. We think that this is a really good podcast to just listen to and help understand how to respond to abuse, what churches need to know, what we can do, and not necessarily that this is a podcast we're saying, hey, this is the only podcast you should listen to, but for educational purposes, it's a wonderful source. And Rachel points out her experience of knowing when it was time to raise those abuse. And she talks about the fact that many people who have been abused feel they need to wait before they share experience of abuse because they're afraid they won't be believed or heard. They need to know that other people went through it, and if other people are willing to back them up, then they can report because they know they'll be believed. And she also points out that there are institutional challenges that we face when we hear an allegation. We are often worried in the reputation of our community and our church. But I think Rachel believes, and I agree, that church leaders don't have the responsibility to protect the reputation of the church. I'm going to say that again. We don't have the responsibility to protect the reputation of the church. And what I mean by that is believing an accusation of abuse carries with it costs. It is going to impact the reputation of a church that we let this happen. But if we are so worried about maintaining that reputation, then we are allowing a virus, a fungus, a disease to grow in this family, in this body of believers. And that is never acceptable. We are the body of Christ, and we cannot allow the cancer of abuse to continue to grow just because disclosing it makes us uncomfortable. So, we're going to take a few minutes and look at some scenarios. So I will read through the scenarios that are on the PowerPoint, and I want you, while I'm reading, to think about the questions that are written on your sheet. Identify who holds the power in this situation. Identify some of the important factors that must be considered. What might be a good response in this situation? And how might this situation have been prevented? All right, so scenario 1, a youth group situation. Sarah was 15 years old and loved youth group. She was always eager to attend and invite her friends. She was extroverted, and some even made fun of her for being so outgoing. The youth group itself was quite large, averaging around 30 high school students, and they always needed more adult leaders. Tom had graduated a few years earlier and enjoyed the time he had spent at youth group as a student, so he volunteered to be a leader and quickly struck up a friendship with Sarah. Soon, Tom even began volunteering to transport Sarah back home after youth group. She thought it was convenient, so she accepted. A few months later, Sarah refused ever going to youth group, and again, a few months later, Sarah refused ever going to youth group again and seemed to cut off many relationships. She refused to talk to her parents, and eventually she saw a counselor. Eventually, she disclosed that Tom began to make sexual advances toward her. She felt overwhelming guilt having done the things she did. So, in just a minute, you'll probably want to pause while you write down your answers to the questions. Identify who holds the power in this situation. Identify some of the important factors that must be considered. What might be a good response in this situation, and how might this situation have been prevented? So go ahead and pause for a minute to make sure you got your answers down, and then I'll give you some. Clearly mine are not all, but some things to think about in regards to these questions. All right, who holds the power in this situation? In this situation, Tom holds the power. He is the leader. He is the one driving the car. He is the older person. He holds the power. Some of the important factors that must be considered. Well, it's worth considering that Tom is a volunteer. Has he had a background check? Tom is part of the church. How is that going to impact the congregation and his family? How is that going to impact Sarah and her family and their attendance? How do we push for reconciliation and restoration of Tom and pursuing him to have right behavior, assuming that the legal mess has been dealt with, while keeping Sarah safe? What might be a good response in this situation? Well, definitely a response would be to report this to the church administrator, to CPS, and to remove Tom from his position until the legal authorities have had a chance to investigate this, and only reinstate him into his position if the legal authorities determine that he did not actually do anything. Because it is not our job to investigate, and we'll talk more about that later. How might this situation have been prevented? Well, having a policy that says if you're driving someone home, it should be of the same sex. If you're driving someone home, you shouldn't be driving them alone. There should be 2 adults in a vehicle. Or even something really strict and saying only parents or relatives can drive kids home. Having a situation like that wouldn't have allowed Tom to be in this position, or wouldn't have allowed Sarah to be in this vulnerable position. All right, scenario 2, a junior leader in kids ministry. Mark was about 14 years old and was a junior leader for a kids program. Mark often followed adults around and would pepper new leaders with all kinds of questions. Mark was often a challenge for leaders, as he often had issues with boundaries, especially physical touch. But the adult leaders also thought it was good that Mark be given an opportunity to grow in character. One night, immediately after a bathroom break, another younger boy, about 10 years old, came running out of the bathroom and told the leader that Mark had come up from behind him and touched him while he was going to the bathroom. The leader asked another leader to follow him into the bathroom to address the issue. Mark seemed to be making a mess with water and laughing about it. After the leaders said they were calling his parents and that he needed to go home immediately, Mark broke down crying. When the leaders notified the parents of the child who was touched and what happened, and they addressed it with both sets of parents, Mark later disclosed to a leader that an adult periodically touched him inappropriately at his house. All right, who holds the power in this situation? What are some important factors that must be considered? What might be a good response in this situation, and how might this situation have been prevented? Go ahead and pause, and then I will go over, write yours down, and then I will go over some possible answers. All right, who holds the power in this situation? Well, certainly the youth leaders, the adult leaders hold power in this situation because they allowed Mark to be there. But also, as Mark is a junior leader, just that term implies that he has power. Some of the important factors that must be considered. Well, it must be considered, it's a very important, relevant fact that Mark himself is an abuser, was abused, because hurt people, and there are many, many, many instances where victims of abuse become abusers. So that's worth considering because that means that Mark needs help as well. Another thing worth considering is that this behavior, Mark's fuzzy boundaries, was known beforehand. So that's worth considering, like, what should be changed in order to prevent a situation like this from happening. A good response, definitely contacting the parents. Again, this should be reported to the administrator, to CPS. If you feel upon later realizing that Mark has been periodically touched by an adult at his home, if he is in danger and cannot go home, that could be a time to call 911. How might this situation have been prevented? Mark should not have been in the bathroom with the younger children alone. Having a 2 adult in the bathroom policy would have prevented this from happening, or having had another child of the same age be in there with this younger child than Mark could have prevented this from happening. Having Mark go through a training before he became a junior leader on what are appropriate boundaries to help him learn those skills and to develop that character before just throwing him in the deep end could have also prevented some of this situation. So these next couple slides are a huge chart of signs of abuse. These are all taken from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services Mandated Reporters Resource Guide. You can also find most, if not all, of these physical and behavioral indicators in your policies and procedures document. I'm just going to list a couple. So some signs of physical abuse that you can keep an eye out for are unexplained bruises or marks, self-destructive or self-mutilation. If someone wears seasonably inappropriate clothing to cover. Some signs of physical neglect include poor hygiene, unexplained weight change, regular displays of fatigue or listlessness. Some signs of medical neglect include untreated serious physical injury, something where a child is hurt and that wound just doesn't heal, social withdrawal, or a loss of interest or enthusiasm in daily activities. A sign of further other maltreatment can include habit or conduct disorders such as sucking, biting, rocking, antisocial, destructive behaviors, or overly adaptive behaviors, such as a child who acts inappropriately like an adult or inappropriately like an infant. Signs of sexual abuse can be pain, itching, bruising, or bleeding in the genital area, sexual behaviors or references that are unusual for a child that age, or that they attach very quickly to new strangers or new adults in their environment. And signs of human trafficking, a particularly malicious form of sexual abuse, could be that
a child avoids eye contact, appears malnourished and or always hungry, and they live with some unrelated youth or unrelated adults, or are traveling with unrelated youth or adults just on their own. So if you see a dramatic shift in a child's behavior, in how they dress, in how they act, how they talk, that can be a warning sign that something bad is going on. It could be something less complicated or equally complicated but less abuse related, as in if parents are getting divorced or there's a new sibling in the home and things have been shaken up. But those dramatic changes, either psychologically, socially, emotionally, behaviorally, can also indicate abuse. Who are the abusers? Unfortunately, stranger danger is almost a myth. Yes, it happens, but most child victims of abuse are abused by a parent. In substantiated child abuse cases, 78% of children were victimized by a parent. Child-on-child abuse is also common. At CACs in 2019, 22% of people alleged to have abused a child when they themselves were children, in cases where the age of the alleged abuser was known. And 14% of the total were teenagers. And yes, the Kent County Children's Advocacy Center, that is their primary work in dealing with children who were abused by children, but also child abuse. So this chart shows the staggering number or percentage of child victims who knew their perpetrator. You can see that only 7% of abusers are strangers and 93% are known to the victim, whether they are acquaintance or family members. And it's worth remembering that survey taken back in 1989 reported that 28% of adults in the CRC had experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, and 15% of adults in the CRC admitted they had abused another person physically, sexually, or emotionally. And remembering again that children between birth and 12 years of age are most at risk, and those with disabilities are also at an increased vulnerability. This next slide is an image of the Responding to Abuse Toolkit. This is a wonderful packet of information that you can order, you can print, you can just look at online, and you can find that online. Either Google CRC Responding to Abuse Toolkit, or you can go to the network.crcna.org and you will find it there. So, moving on from abuse, how often it happens, what it looks like, to how to respond, because your response mattered. We saw that Rachel Den Hollander said that many people wait to respond, or she waited to respond until she thought she would be believed, because if they don't think they're going to be believed, then they don't have a reason to tell. If it's going to be your word against mine or my word against theirs, then they're not going to report. So most of the information on why people don't respond is taken from an article on Psychology Today. And it all tends to root in they don't feel that they will be believed. Another option is that when they reported abuse, the response was inappropriate. So if they were told, oh my goodness, that you shouldn't have told me that, that's terrible, or over dramatizing or minimizing, or asking too many personal questions to delve into, or investigating the situation and then blowing things up, that's not great. So if we can respond well, we not only show the victim that we believe them, we affirm that they are valuable members of our community and valuable members of the family of God. And we can also provide a foundation for healing, because those who are not disclosing are carrying this burden until they can have healing. So, what do we need to do when we respond? 4 things. 1, listen. Give the individual a chance to tell his or her story. It is their story. It is not your story. Let them use their words as much as possible and try to react as little as possible. Try not to show shock or disgust because that can discourage further disclosure. Don't ask leading questions. You are not investigating. You are just hearing their story. So don't say, well, what did they do or where did this happen? We don't need the details. You can just say, can you tell me more? Because we don't want to put words into someone's mouth. We want them to tell us. And I've said this before, but it's very much worth reminding. Don't investigate. It is not our job to investigate. Right now, the person disclosing to you needs your support. They don't need you to solve this problem for them because it's going to take more than just you. And you do not want to confront the accuser because if you do, they will know that they are in trouble and they might react by taking out further action on the victim. So you could actually make the situation worse by confronting the person being accused of abuse. So you've listened. Now you affirm. You thank them for telling you and you assure them that it was the right thing to do, that you're glad they didn't keep this secret. You're glad they trusted you as a safe person to tell. And then report. Your policies and procedures says that you have to do 3 things within 24 hours, but really do them ASAP. First, you need to report to the administrator or to the ministry leader or call the Child Protection National Hotline for help in knowing how and what to report, and that number is 1-800-4-A-CHILD. Then you should call CPS, which is 855-444-3911. So you're going to tell the administrator, call 1-800-4-CHILD for guidance on how to proceed and what to say to CPS, and then you're going to call CPS, all within 24 hours of seeing something that causes you to suspect abuse or having someone tell you they were abused. After that, but for sure within the 72 hours following the incident, fill out the report of suspected or actual child abuse or neglect. And this is an appendix to your policies and procedures. Another thing to do that's very important is don't gossip. Once you have done those 4 things, told just the administrator or the ministry leader, you're not looping everybody in and telling. Gossip doesn't help the situation. It spreads rumors. We know how fast false information can spread, and we don't want to damage someone's reputation unnecessarily, and we also don't want to endanger someone unnecessarily by spreading rumors or stories. Finally, after you've listened, affirmed, and reported, you need to support the individual. With permission, check in with the accuser and the family in the following weeks and months. They're going to need help. This is a hard thing to go through. You can point the accuser and their family towards support services. Maybe they need to go to the police, the Children's Advocacy Center. Maybe they need to seek help through Safe Haven if it's a domestic violence situation. Maybe they'll need recommendation for a group support or for a therapist. Maybe they're going to need financial help to pay for some of this stuff. Those are all ways that you can respond and support someone making an accusation. It's also worth thinking about how can we protect this person further? How can we avoid putting them in situations where they have to confront their abuser? Because that is another way of almost re-abusing someone. It's triggering the abuse again for them to have to be with their abuser. So remove that abuser from their position and have them follow your procedures for someone who is guilty of criminal sexual conduct, where they sign a covenant and they have supervisors and they have mentors, all wonderful things. So you do not have to investigate, you do not have to prove anything. That is something you need to leave to the legal professionals, the law enforcement and lawyers and that kind of thing. But if you know that someone is confirmed guilty, then you really need to think about how you're moving forward with that, how you're removing them from their positions, and how if they're not in jail, how they are going to be restored to the congregation in a way that is still safe for those that they have offended. So this last slide comes from a list of questions that I got from a Classis Grandville church. And I think that they are just really helpful questions because they're probably questions that you've had about like responding to abuse. So the first question, who is responsible to respond? On page 106 of your policies and procedures document, it says, staff members who are ministers are mandatory reporters. 2, all other paid and or volunteer staff members, including custodial staff and nursery or child care staff. 3, and all volunteer teachers and leaders who have reasonable cause to suspect child abuse or neglect, which includes verbal reports and or observations, are required to report it. Basically, everybody is required to report it. It's worth noting that in the United States, there are only certain people who are mandated reporters, preachers, teachers, therapists, that kind of thing. But in Canada, anyone over the age of 18 is a mandated reporter. That means that you could face legal consequences for not reporting. I'm not saying we should report out of fear of preventing legal consequences, but I'm saying it's worth thinking about what duty we have to our brothers and sisters in Christ to report, to protect them and restore them and protect others. So, are there levels of response? Or just always call the number? Always follow those 4 steps that are in your policies and procedure. Report it to the administrator and or ministry leader, and always call those numbers, the national hotline and CPS, and then fill out that report. Why? It's like, what is this first step? Once you hear of a situation, how do we know it's true? That's not our concern. If you have suspicions of abuse, if in doubt, report. Yes, there are stories we hear of CPS doing a bad job, but CPS's job is child protection. They are interested in the best situation for the child. If that's reunification with parents, that's what they want. If that's removal from the home, that's what they're going to do. So we don't have to worry about whether or not this kid is making a false claim or, that's weird. If you are concerned, report it to the administrator, call the national hotline, call CPS, and file a report, because the report says of actual or suspected. So if you suspect it, report. So those are the first steps, right? Unless the situation involves direct and immediate harm to a child, then your first response should be calling 911, and then you can follow those remaining 4 steps. What leadership should be involved? As we've said, the administrator and or ministry leader, and then they can loop in your church's Safe Church team. And then that's it. You're not talking about this with your family, with your girlfriends, with your friends, with your mom's group, with the other leaders. Only those who need to know should know, and that's for the protection of both the accuser and the accused. How do you evaluate when a full response is needed? You don't evaluate, you just respond. It is not our jobs to do the investigating. We are not trained for that, we are not paid for that. Our job is to love, protect, and raise these kids in hearts and minds for Christ in our roles. We don't have to make that evaluation. If in doubt, report. And then, what safety protocols in church have been effective, in my view? Well, making sure that your current Safe Church team is passionate and committed to abuse prevention and response. Because if they don't care, then your congregation's not going to care. So if you care about abuse prevention, response, and prevention, then you might want to speak to your administrator about being on this team. I would suggest it only be an odd number, about 3 to 5 members. Another wonderful way to help prevent and respond to child abuse is the Circle of Grace curriculum. I know that you guys have had some familiarity with that. I know that the parents haven't been requested to be involved, and that
We're not exactly sure how Circle of Grace is going to work moving forward, but at a bare minimum, I would encourage each and every one of you to get a list of the vocabulary used in Circle of Grace and familiarize yourself with the terms that are appropriate for the ages you are working with, and then use that vocabulary, such as chat rooms for middle schoolers and high schoolers, such as red light, green light, yellow light situation, such as trusted adult, such as uncomfortable or boundaries, so that if you are comfortable using this language, then your students will be comfortable using this language. And a student or a child who is more likely to say, that's not comfortable, I don't like that, is less likely to be abused because they're already learning to be an advocate for themselves. Another thing to remember is, as uncomfortable and ugly as this topic is, we can't keep silent about it. We have to let some of our discomfort go, because comfortable is not where we grow. Comfortable is not where we protect others. Sometimes comfort hurts people, and sometimes to protect others, we need to step out of our comfort zone. Another policy that is good for working with youth and protecting them are some of the policies that you already have, like avoiding sitting alone in cars with one-on-one with the youth, or especially children who are not your own, or being careful about who and how people are transporting to and from events. An example of how you could approach this is something that my husband and I do, is if we have a babysitter, and it's a female babysitter, I take the babysitter home. That just protects my husband from any false accusations. It protects our female babysitter from any uncomfortable situations. And it's just the safest way for our family to transport that person home. All right, so with Circle of Grace, I think it's really worth taking a look at the Circle of Grace saying. So it's raise your hands above your head and then bring your outstretched arms slowly down. Extend your arms in front of you and then behind. Embrace all the space around you. Then slowly reach down to your feet. Know that God is in this space with you. This is your Circle of Grace and you are in it. And I really love what's at the bottom of this slide. What would our world look like if we all lived believing and truly knowing that God is that close? What hope would that give? How would that check our behavior? And how would that help us as we raise and nourish and bless and care for and love and celebrate with the children of our congregations? So that's a lot of information. I hope that the worksheet was helpful in getting it in your heads and getting it down on paper. I want you to know that if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, either via your administrator or your Safe Church team, or via my email. It's really easy. It is Grandville Safe Church, no spaces, Grandville Safe Church @gmail.com. And I am here to help you guys as you move forward in serving the children of your congregation so that they can grow and be rooted as disciples in Christ. Thanks for watching.